JT says, court, it's not whether it's needed dragging people into courts. I think it's highly disrespectful to the victim for the court and justice system to allow someone facing court to opt out of attending. Yes, they should be dragged, kicking and screaming, to stand and face the judge. They committed the crime. They left the victim with no choices. Therefore, the perp's choices should be removed. And again, I get that. I think on paper, ultimately, I'd agree with that. In practice, can it always work? Let's speak with Roy Ramm, ex-commander of Special Operations at Scotland Yard, and also Helen Fields, former criminal barrister turned writer. Good afternoon to you both. It's that point, Helen, isn't it, that the notionally, yeah, let's make that happen. In practical terms, that might turn out to be something we could regret.
You know, it's really difficult. And I don't think there's any debate from anybody but that criminals who committed offences should be in court for their sentencing. It's absolutely the right thing. Yep. I think across the board, everybody feels exactly the same way. The issue is this, that there are 2 points at which somebody convicted of an offence would need to be brought to court. The first is they have to be brought out of a prison cell. That involves the decisions of the prison governors and prison staff. Now, they're fairly well set up to understand what reasonable force is and to use, whether it's handcuffing or lifting or restraints. The difference is by the time they get to court, they usually come in a prison van, they're in the cells. It's the cell staff who have to get them from in the cells at the court into the dock. Those people don't have at their, beck and call the level of support that it might be needed. And also you can't expect them to actually assault a prisoner. It's one thing being able to use restraints. That takes a lot of staffing. It takes a lot of people, and it takes a huge amount of training. And our courts are underfunded as they are. What we can't do is allow the possibility that cell staff, that the people in the courts themselves might end up injured or might have to assault people. So the question here is not should we do it? The question is how we do it, keeping everyone safe and being practical about it. A better option, honestly, is to make sure this is done by video link in the prison, where prison staff are much, much better set up and they have better training to do this. Yeah,
I hadn't even really thought about that part of the process. We often hear that, we hear a criminal go, it took 10 officers to hold me down. Well, it didn't take 10. It only took 10 to keep it done, to make it happen safely, of course, and you would be required to have something similar in those situations if somebody kicked off. Roy Ramm, it's a fair point, isn't it? You'd have to, on every case, particularly high-profile cases where somebody is likely to get a life sentence, where the perpetrator, the guilty party has been found guilty already, you'd have to have like 10 officers on standby in case something like this happened, right?
I don't disagree with pretty much anything that Helen has said. It is difficult, without any shadow of a doubt. These are relatively rare cases. I think we ought to think about that as well. This is not a daily occurrence, but when one looks at some of the people who have declined to be there to have to hear their sentence, people like Levi Belfield, people like Hashem Abedi, the Manchester bomber, and of course Lucy Letby. We need a system which gives the families and the public some insight into their reaction when they receive that sentence. And I do think that there is easily scope to set up a video room in a prison, and when it's clear that a prisoner is going to decline to come to court to hear their sentence, they can be taken into that room, placed there, and they can know that the public can see them. I think very often police officers who end up having relationships with families of victims for months, sometimes years after a trial is over, would very much welcome that.
Would that be one compromise then, Helen? You could certainly put somebody in a room and pipe the video feed or the audio into it, and if you needed to, as Roy was just suggesting, you could have that filmed for the benefit of the court.
Yeah, almost all prisons these days have video rooms. During COVID, what happened was that a number of hearings, almost all hearings, took place via video link. So prisons are set up for this, and it does avoid the problem with cell staff who are not adequately equipped having to deal with it. It can be dealt with inside the prisons, yes, absolutely. It's a little bit of a compromise. I think a lot of victims' families, police officers, prosecutors would feel that they'd want someone in court, but of course it is the next best thing. But let's think, seriously about this. There are other ways of doing it. I mean, certainly in the case of Lucy Letby, I do think that one of the things we know about her was that her family stood by her, a couple of friends stood by her. The only thing she's got left, for example, is visits over the next few years. And also all prisoners are usually on an incentive scheme so that they can earn privilege inside a prison. It doesn't necessarily have to resort to force. I think if you'd said to Lucy Letby, the prison governor has said, if you want to see have any personal visits for the next 2 years, to keep you sane, then you're going to go to court and you're going to behave yourself. So there are things that, rather than just saying, well, it's use of force or nothing to get them into a room, there are other ways of dealing with these people. And believe me, if you're facing a long prison sentence, you do not want to lose the few privileges you have.
And that's a very good point. And I assume this will be at the discretion of the judge. These new powers, as it were, will be at the discretion of the judge. And I would imagine most judges, on balance, are probably not going to force somebody into the dock.
There'd have to be a good reason. It would have to be, I suspect, when the legislation comes through, and I'm sure it will, there would have to be all sorts of caveats to it, and the case would have to be a serious enough one to justify it, because our prisons and our cells are desperately overstretched. They don't need this happening in every case. When it's a serious case, and I suspect you'll find it will be for cases involving violence or children. That's the sort of thing that we're probably looking at. Then these special measures will come into force, and rightly so. And also it's about not just the victims of families, and it's about seeing justice done across the board. Our justice system is important to everyone. We all understand how this works and that it's the cornerstone of part of our society, and it does need both to work and to be seen to work across society. So this is important.
And I guess, Roy, one of the problems at the moment, and you will have seen this as a serving officer, and Helen would have certainly seen it as a barrister, we mentioned this to our previous guest as well, there is always the potential, and this happens already when people are there for their own sentencing, that the accused, the person that's just been given X amount of years in jail, then shouts something pretty horrific back to the families who are watching this, the families of a daughter who's been brutalised in some kind of way. Shouting back the most horrendous offensive comments, and that is something nobody wants to. One wonders if you'd force them there, you might even increase that possibility.
There is always that risk, of course, and I don't think anyone wants to see a really distressing situation in court. There has to be some assessment of what's going to happen, what's going to take place, and it's getting that balance right. And I hear what Helen says about perhaps offering some kind of reverse incentive, if that's the phrase, of you might lose privileges, or you might not get privileges, you might not give visitations, etc. And I think that's worth considering. But certainly we don't want to end up in a situation where somebody is physically dragged screaming into court, and the distress that their appearance makes, just adds to the distress that the victims and the families have already suffered.
Yeah, indeed. Listen, Roy, Helen, thank you both